Okay, so you've probably seen this term critical legal theory thrown around, right? It's everywhere, in the news, online, usually wrapped up in some kind of controversy. But what does it actually mean? Well, today we're going to cut through all that noise. We're going to break down the core ideas behind this really influential and, let's be honest, often misunderstood way of thinking about the law. So, first things first, how on earth did a pretty niche academic theory end up becoming such a huge headline-grabbing deal? That's exactly where we're going to start. All right, so let's get right to it. What is critical legal theory? I mean, you've definitely heard the name, but the actual definition, it tends to get completely lost in all the back and forth. And here's why. This theory basically made a giant leap from the quiet world of academic journals straight into the middle of the political battlefield. And when that happened, a lot of its original meaning just kind of got left behind. This has caused a ton of confusion, you know? You've got critics and even defenders sometimes talking past each other, maybe missing the key ideas. Okay, so probably the best way to get your head around critical legal theory, or CLT for short, is to not think of it as one single set of rules. It's more like a method, a kind of toolbox, really, for looking at the law from a bunch of different angles. So what's at the heart of it? Well, CLT basically challenges that classic view of the law as this totally neutral and rational system. Instead, it starts asking some pretty provocative questions, like, what if the very foundations of our legal system aren't as solid or objective as we've always been told? And it does this by using what it calls different lenses. Think of it like putting on different pairs of glasses. So, for example, some scholars might put on a feminist lens to see how patriarchy gets baked into legal structures. Others might use a racial lens to dig into systemic oppression. Or you could use a Marxist lens to see how the law reflects economic power. See, it's not just one thing. It's a whole bunch of different ways to look at the same subject. And all of this really gets to one of the central arguments of CLT, that the law is not this separate, isolated thing. It's not detached from politics or morality or economics. The whole idea is that because law is made by people, by society, it's going to be deeply tangled up with all those other social forces. Okay, so if that's the starting point, how does this perspective actually challenge the basic ideas we usually have about the rule of law? Let's dive into that. Right here is where you can see the two worldviews just clash. On one hand, you have the traditional view, law is supposed to be neutral, predictable, something that upholds justice for everyone. But CLT comes along and flips that completely on its head. It argues that law is actually political, it's subjective, and in many ways, it's a tool that actually ends up reinforcing the power structures that are already in place. And this quote really drives that critique home. From a CLT point of view, these huge legal concepts we talk about, like equality and justice, they aren't these timeless, universal truths. Instead, the theory suggests they're more like powerful fictions, stories the legal system tells to give off this perception of being neutral and fair. So you might be wondering, where did all these radical ideas come from? To really get CLT, we've got to go back and look at its intellectual family tree and a couple of key concepts that it's built on. So CLT itself really came onto the scene in the US back in the 1970s. But its roots, they go back even further, to a movement in the 20s and 30s called American realism. And these realists, they were really the first ones to seriously challenge that old school idea that law was this pure, logical, almost mathematical system. But, and this is a big but, CLT and American realism are definitely not the same thing. You see, the realists, they wanted to study law from a sociological angle, but they were still pretty much working inside the traditional box of liberalism. CLT, on the other hand, goes way further. It actually rejects that liberal framework. It argues that law isn't just influenced by politics. It argues law is politics, that it's a force that can actively create and sustain social hierarchies. So, to explain how this all works without everyone constantly questioning it, CLT borrows a concept called hegemonic consciousness from a theorist named Antonio Gramsci. It sounds complicated, but the idea is pretty simple. It's when a system of beliefs gets so dominant, so widespread, that we all just start accepting it as common sense. It makes the way things are feel totally natural and inevitable instead of something that was, built by people. And there's another key concept here called reification. This is basically when we take these big, abstract ideas like the law or justice and start treating them like they're solid physical things. CLT argues that these concepts aren't things we just find out in the world, like a mountain or a river. Nope, They're ideas that we, as a society, create and then give real power to. So this sets up a huge contradiction, right? How does society deal with that? Well, CLT scholars borrow an idea from psychology, basically denial. On one hand, we like to think the law is all about promoting equality and freedom. But on the other hand, CLT argues, the reality is that it can also uphold oppression and hierarchy. According to the theory, that's a really painful contradiction to live with. So as a society, we collectively kind of deny it just to get by. And all of this brings us to what is easily CLT's most famous and definitely its most controversial offshoot. I'm pretty sure you've heard of this one, critical race theory. Yeah, it's really helpful to see how these ideas are connected. You can think of it like steps. Critical race theory, or CRT, grew right out of critical legal theory. It basically takes the exact same toolkit we've been talking about, but it applies that toolkit specifically through the lens of race. So, in a nutshell, what CRT does is it uses the methods of critical legal theory to look at how race and racism have shaped our laws and legal institutions, and then how those very same systems might continue to create or reinforce racial inequality. Now, CRT also has a few methods that are pretty distinct to it. For one, it often puts a big emphasis on personal stories and narratives. The idea is to challenge the official legal accounts and argue that these personal stories can reveal truths that a more traditional legal analysis might just completely overlook. It also uses what are called revisionist interpretations of history, which means looking back at major events like the American Civil Rights Movement, but from a completely different perspective. And it's really important to be clear about that term revisionist history. In everyday conversation, it can sound like a bad thing, right? But in an academic context, it's not a criticism. It's a scholarly method. It just means you're re-examining historical events, maybe with new evidence or through a new lens, to see if you can find different insights or challenge assumptions that we've held for a long time. And that really brings us to the final big picture thought here. At its very core, what critical legal theory does is it forces us to ask a really fundamental question. Is the law an objective truth that we just discover, something that exists out there separate from us? Or is it something that we create, a powerful, complex, and maybe even contradictory story that our society tells itself about justice, about power, and ultimately about who we are?